Hello everybody, it's Hunter's dad, and I'm back with another paper which has just recently come out this month on the prognosis or the follow-up of individuals diagnosed in childhood with autism or Asperger's disorder, looking at their outcome in their adult life in their early 20s on average. Why is this important? This is the largest and most systematic study of outcome in autism. Previous studies have been done that have shown outcome in a handful of individuals in a relatively uncontrolled fashion. In this study, they looked at 76 individuals diagnosed with Asperger's and the same amount of individuals diagnosed with autism, diagnosed at a single clinic between 1985 and 1999, and then they got back to those individuals and subjected them to a battery of testing to look at their functioning. And that was a minimum of 5 years after their diagnosis, but there was a large range. The individuals were diagnosed at an average age of about 10 years old, and they were followed up at an average age in their early 20s. After my son was diagnosed, when he was 4 years old or so, my wife held out the hope that with treatment he was going to be normal, that he was going to be cured, that he was going to lose the diagnosis of PDD. And one of the few times that I've seen my wife cry was when I showed her a paper that discussed the outcome of autism and the fact that autism is a lifetime diagnosis and that the outcome was fairly poor in terms of independent functioning. This was a big shock for her, and it was one of the things that I had the most difficulty coping with. It was a long period of mourning and sadness that I felt when I discovered this. The paper is entitled Asperger's Syndrome and Autism, a Comparative Longitudinal Follow-Up Study more than 5 years after original diagnosis. The paper is from Sweden, and it's published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, which is a major journal in this field. The authors divided outcome into 4 categories. One category they said is good, and that was that you had to have both good occupational functioning and independent living, so that you had to be employed or be in higher education, 1, and 2, you had to be living independently or have at least 2 friends. That was good. Fair was one or the other of the criteria, but not both. So either employed or living independently, but not both. They called a fair outcome. Restricted outcome was neither of the above criteria, occupational or living, but free of major psychiatric disorders and not severely handicapped. In other words, you had enough intact functioning to be in a group home, and so forth. And poor and very poor, obvious severe handicap, highly dependent individuals in institutions or dependent on care for their activities of daily living. So that was good, fair, restricted, and poor or very poor. So what was their findings? In the Asperger's group, 27% had a good outcome. They were employed and they lived independently. A fair outcome, 47%. So about half of the individuals either had occupational functioning or schooling, or they were living independently, but not both. That was 47%. Restricted outcome, 23%. That was people who had neither effective occupational functioning nor living independently, but were not severely handicapped. That was 23%. And poor outcome or very poor outcome, only 3%. So on average, individuals with Asperger's syndrome, about a quarter of them did well, functioned in both arenas, and about a half did fair. They functioned in one or the other arenas. What about the autism group? Of the autistic group, none had a good outcome. 7% had a fair outcome. That means they either functioned occupationally or they lived independently. 17% had a restricted outcome, neither occupational nor independent living. 20% had a poor outcome and 56% had a very poor outcome, which basically means that they were dependent on an institution or other individuals for their daily needs. What about the stability of diagnosis over time? Did individuals with Asperger's disorder continue to have Asperger's disorder? Did they lose the diagnosis? And what happened with the autistic individuals? Did they become, quote, Asperger's individuals? Let's look at that. Of the Asperger's syndrome group, 75% continued to have the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. 10% had gone into the diagnosis of autistic disorder. And 4% were called atypical autism. And 11% did not meet the criteria for any autistic disorder. So in general, the Asperger's syndrome, 75% continued to have Asperger's syndrome. 11% lost the diagnosis altogether, and a small handful were then considered either autistic or atypical autism. What about the autistic group? None of them migrated into the category of Asperger's syndrome. 83% continued to have the diagnosis of autism. 16% were considered atypical autism, and only 1% of the individuals with autism lost the diagnosis. So, in summary, the diagnosis of autistic disorder remained quite stable over time, and the outcome was, depending on how you define it, relatively poor. Most individuals with autism did not function independently, either in living situation or in their occupational situation. In terms of Asperger's disorder, the outcome was somewhat better, with about a quarter functioning both occupationally and independently, living independently, but the majority of them did not do both. Well, what does this mean for parents of autistic children, and what can parents take home from this? And I think the message is that if your child has autism, he is not going to be cured, and you shouldn't feel that his continued autism is due to some kind of lack of effort on your part. That in fact, the diagnosis of autism is a lifetime diagnosis, and your child's functioning is going to be impaired, and that's a very difficult thing to accept. But I think it ultimately relieves you of some feeling of guilt and helps you to accept your child. In terms of individuals with Asperger's disorder, again, it's only a minority of individuals who are going to have completely, quote, typical functioning. On the other hand, the outcome of Asperger's disorder is much better than that of autism. And there is, a majority of individuals do have some level of functioning, either occupationally or in their independent living.